Riverside FM.
Welcome to Do Good Work Podcast, hosted by Terrell Strayhorn and Jaquin Johnson. We specialize in taking a deep dive into issues that truly matter. Each episode unpacks the challenges and opportunities facing today's leaders, from classrooms to boardrooms, offering insights that inspire real change. By redefining success, we're changing lives, empowering people everywhere to create environments where everyone feels a sense of belonging, whether at home, work, or school. So hey, sit back, relax, grab your favorite beverage, and join us as we explore the issues shaping our futures, one meaningful conversation at a time. Let's go!
Welcome back to another episode of the Do Good Work Podcast. I am your co-host, Terrell, joined by my co-host,
Jaquin Johnson, you know.
And we are so excited to have each and every one of you tuning in for this week's episode. We've got a dynamic guest and speaker, scholar brother in the academy, Dr. Hasan Jeffries. I'm gonna let him say his middle name the way it's supposed to be said. How's it supposed to be pronounced?
That's it. You got it right. You nailed it.
Look at me. And so we're delighted to have him.
Did it take some practice? Did it take some practice to get it down?
No, I just had to think real hard about what I was about to say and remember back. So listen, if you are listening in, tuning in on any social media platform, we're live on Facebook, Spotify, YouTube, Instagram. Well, not Instagram. What's the other one called? Twitter, X, and LinkedIn. Do us a favor, like and share so that folks know it's time to tune in. Before we get into the conversation with Dr. Jeffries, you don't want them to miss it. So listen, tonight's episode, if you know anybody who needs a good lesson, a real talk lesson on history, on politics, on race inequality or equality in America, folks who are looking for that kind, and it's Black History Month. Happy Black History Month to you. Go ahead, like, share, tag someone in the post. You can use the tag. You can use hashtag Black History Month. But go ahead and help us circulate and get folks to tune in. And if you have not already, we invite you to follow us on all things social media at Do Good Work. All right, so without further ado, we're going to jump into it. I only have one or two more things to do here on my end. All right, we are shared across. So before we get into our introduction of our speaker and jump into the live questions, y'all know how we do it. We start each and every episode off talking about our day or our week, and we use a word that starts with the first letter of our last name. So I'll kick it over to Jaquin to kick us off.
Oh boy, this is like the toughest thing each week. I'm gonna go with jubilant. I think that I had a pretty productive week. A lot of things that I had on my list were checked off, and starting a new writing project. So it's pretty exciting.
Awesome. Dr. Jeffries, what about yourself?
Yeah, I'm gonna. Jay is the last name, so I'm gonna go with jarring. Jarring.
Ooh,
this is
jarring.
Jarring in the sense of just watching what's going on with the administration and national politics. It's just you feel like you're catching blows from every angle. So jarring leapt to mind as what this week was.
Absolutely. And I'm going to go with the word steady. Steady doesn't necessarily mean slow. It's been a nonstop kind of week. Lots of travel, lots of talks, lots of things to do, writing and getting things done for clients. So it's been a pretty steady week. But what better way to sort of wrap up your week than to be here in the podcast and having a dynamic conversation tonight about Black freedom movement, issues of racial equality. And so if you had a tough week, listen, love and light to you. Lean in, don't lean back, lean into tonight's conversation because we've got exactly what you need in the studio. So before we go into our lineup of questions. Let me introduce to some and present to others Professor Hasan Jeffries, who is a historian, serves as the Alumni Associate Professor of History at The Ohio State University. He is a historian specializing in African American history. Through his scholarship and research, he has chronicled the civil rights movement in Audible's Great Figures of the Civil Rights Movement. And he explored the original Black Panther Party in Bloody, how do you say that word?
Lowndes.
Lowndes. I was thinking about it in the plane today, and I swore up and down that Siri didn't know what she was talking about, and she doesn't. So Lowndes, and we'll talk about that because he's looked at Lowndes and several other projects as well. Professor Jeffries led the $27 million redesign of the National Civil Rights Museum. Y'all hear me? He led the redesign of the National Civil Rights Museum and chairs the Mount Pillier Foundation Board. We get to talk about it. Professor at The Ohio State University, go Bucks. He hosted Teaching Hard History podcasts and edited Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement. His TEDx talk has over 2 million views, and he's been featured in major media outlets, documentaries, public history projects. And as if that's not enough, he is in fact the brother of the Democratic leader, Hasan Jeffries. No, that's you, Hakeem Jeffries. And we'll talk about it. We put it in everything that y'all saw on social media today. So we've got Professor Jeffries. We can sort of tap into Congressman Jeffries, and we're going to talk about all of it tonight. So wherever you are tuning in from, feel free to use the chat. Drop some comments, drop your questions. We've got some prepared comments. But before we go, I should say this. I'd be remiss if I didn't say, when on the faculty at The Ohio State University, Professor Jeffries was a good scholar, brother, and friend. During my time there, I remember there was a sort of racial climate issue. And this was during the killing of, I think it was Trayvon Martin, if I'm not mistaken. And someone desecrated and defaced our Black Cultural Center. Students protested, they marched, they stormed the board trustees meeting, and then they organized a sort of civil protest. Part of that was they had teach-ins. And so I remember very vividly Brother Dr. Jeffries being a part of those teach-ins, sitting in the student union, teaching students about what he's going to talk about tonight. So he's not just writing about it. He's not just on TED Talks about it. He lives it, he breathes it, and we are delighted to have you in the studio. Dr. Jeffries, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with you. And you brought me back. I mean, it seems like a lifetime, a career ago when that happened. So much has happened since then. But I wasn't alone. You were right there with me. And
That's
several
exactly
other
right.
wonderful faculty. It's about, this as Black faculty, it's not just about sort of being there and confining yourself to your office or the classroom. We wouldn't be there if it wasn't for students who were engaged in protests over the years. So when they send out the call, it's important for us to answer. And I think now is one of those times too.
Yeah, so right about it. We're going to jump in. I mean, go ahead.
Go ahead, friend. No, friend. No, go ahead, friend. You in the flow.
No, what were you great to say?
It's interesting that you said that. It's like, as Black faculty, when students call, you got to step up and be there for them. But, I also want to kind of pick both of you all's brain about, as an early scholar could be a Black faculty member and want to be there, but it could hinder your career. How do you navigate that space?
Yeah. I am of the mind, and I saw this when I was in graduate school. Actually, there was stuff going on with the graduate school at Duke, and there was stuff going on, on campus, and undergraduates called our attention to it and wanted a few of us to sort of engage with them. And I had some colleagues, graduate student colleagues, who were like, I can't do it. I'm worried about what the possible implications might be. I'll wait till I get, a tenure track job. It's like, okay, so now they got the tenure track job and something's popping off. And they were like, yeah, I'm worried about tenure. So I'll wait till tenure. It's like, all right. Then the same colleague, they got tenure. They're supposed to prefer, well, I'm worried about promotion to full. So I'm just going to let that ride. And then the next thing you know, they're retired. and they ain't done nothing, right? So, there's always going to be challenges and potential consequences. Um, but sometimes when you called, I think you got to answer. It's important that we try to always be on the right side of history. That doesn't mean that we have to do everything, sort of be on the front line leading the charge, but there's always something that we can do. Sometimes it means you have to be on the front line. I mean, but not every time. I am really, really cognizant of the fact, being at a place like Ohio State, if it wasn't for students who got kicked out in the late 1960s, 68, 69, 70, taking over buildings, demanding that Black faculty be there, I wouldn't have been there. But Strayhorn, you wouldn't have been there, right? And so my way of paying it back is to try to always kind of pay it forward, or be there for the students who have inherited that mantle, going forward. But in the end, as long as we're doing something, again, I think that's what's most important.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that, um, people will always have, as you said, some reason to avoid or to hold back or to, and it's not bad. I mean, it's self-interest, but you got to pay your bills, you got to take care of your family, and so these are important considerations. But when you really are sort of conscious of the bigger work, the larger work, and I think there's a level of intellectual integrity that people have to have, of like, if you're going to study these issues, they ought to influence how you show up and how you live and how you move through your career. And so you just commit to it. And I think this is a great sort of segue into what we want to talk about tonight. So Dr. Jeffries, your research examines the Black freedom movement. A lot of it goes in a number of directions that are all sort of clustered together, but you have sort of unapologetically studied the Black freedom movement beyond just the civil rights era. So what are some of those overlooked or lesser known moments in this struggle that you think we should be talking about more today, especially given all that's going on in the world?
Yeah. Well, there's so much. I mean, one of the challenges with teaching sort of civil rights history, it's different than sort of other subjects within history. It's different than other subjects than such a math or biology, in that there's students come in knowing something, right? They feel that they understand something about this past. They've been exposed to it in some way, shape, or form, but usually what they've been exposed to, it ain't right. And so it's one of those subjects where there has to be a lot of unlearning before there can be the substantive learning. And a lot of the unlearning has to do with this inherited narrative. And Julian Bond, civil rights activist from SNCC, used to teach at UVA history until he passed away not that long ago. He talked about this master narrative that dominates our understanding of the civil rights movement, that has it narrowly confined to the chronological period of 1954, 1955, Brown decision, or the Montgomery bus boycott, up until King's death. And just chronologically speaking, if we think about the civil rights movement just in those narrow terms, we miss so much of what came before as well as what came after. You can't understand the way in which people organized for change in the 50s and 60s unless you understand not only what they were up against in the 50s and 60s, but also what they were up against in the decades leading up to that, which determined in large part how they fought, not just what they fought for, but how they fought. So, we're talking about veterans taking the lead and trying to register to vote, coming home from World War II, in 1945, 1946. 1947. That we need to think about. We're talking about African-American, Black middle-class folk, professional folk in cities outside of the South, trying to purchase homes and trying to move into all white suburbs, newly developed suburbs like Levittown, and literally having their homes firebombed, whether we're talking about New Jersey or Philadelphia or outside of Milwaukee or Detroit. We're talking about African-American women and not just those who had advanced college degrees, but domestic workers and sharecroppers, whether they're in the Deep South or who were organizing in places like Atlanta or Detroit, everyday people who were making change. I mean, so there's so many stories that just get overlooked because we're confining ourselves to understanding the movement within this decade plus, and we're centering all our stories around Dr. King. And which is important, right? I mean, clearly a pivotal leader within the civil rights movement, but the movement was more than King, and it's important that we look beyond him. We can't have a King-centric, as I'd say, King-centric understanding of the movement, because even the version of King that we get isn't the version that lived, right? It's just this version that has him frozen in the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So we could almost, no matter, if I equate, and I'll say this real quick, I try to describe when I think about the civil rights movement, I think about a night sky. And, if you find a dark enough corner of the world and you look up at the night sky, you realize that every inch of the sky is covered by stars, but we don't always see them. But just because we don't see them doesn't mean they're not there. And I think about those stars as being representative of different local African-American communities. And the visibility is the activism. But we don't always see the activism. We see the activism in those places. We see the stars that are burning most intensely, most brightly. That's the activism that has reached the public surface. But just because we don't see the activism, that intensity, the protest hasn't risen to the level of a social movement, doesn't mean that people aren't organizing, doesn't mean that people aren't fighting, doesn't mean that people aren't protesting in their own ways. So it's always there. The persistence of Black resistance is at the heart of the African-American experience. We just have to look for it, right? And it's not even time specific. We got to look for the place and we got to find the time, and you will see in that moment examples of activism that have lessons for us today.
Wow. Yeah. Love that. Persistence of resistance is in the tradition. It's in the race. It's in every movement that every part of our movement. Jaquin?
Wow, way to kick it off. I got lost for a minute. I was like, I was taking notes myself. But you talk about, civil rights movement and unlearning. A lot of unlearning happens. And you also talk about the challenges of teaching American history honestly, particularly regarding slavery and racism. So in today's climate, where history education is under attack, what advice do you have for educators committed to ensuring students get the full truth?
Yeah. Well, that's timely and relevant. I think the answer to that is, one is, we don't have a choice when it comes to teaching truth. That's non-negotiable, because not to teach history the way it happened and not to draw meaning from it is to teach a version of the past that didn't exist. And that's whether you're fabricating something or you're strategically leaving something out. If we're doing that, then we are committing educational malpractice. And none of us take as educators, take the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath. But if we did, just like physicians, the first line would be, do no harm. And when we don't teach the truth, either by acts of commission or omission, then we are actually committing harm. So the first answer, the 1A answer, is we have to teach it. So it's not a question of whether or not we do or we don't. The answer is we do. Now the question becomes, how do we in this moment? The good news is, if we were in church, the good news, there's a lot of trouble, but the good news, right? The good news is we don't have to make anything up. In fact, there's nothing in the work that we teach, in the history that we teach, that we have to necessarily change, because it's all true, right? Whether we're talking about the role of race and racism in American society, true. The role of sexism in American society, true. The harm that capitalism creates in American society, it's true. Like this, we don't gotta make anything up. It's all true. What we do have to do is make sure that in the classroom, that our teachers and that our students in particular, and if we're talking about K through 12, then it's students and parents, that we invite people into the classroom, right? That if you're a K through 12 teacher and you're teaching this history, and we should be teaching in age appropriate ways from kindergarten up through high school, then invite the parents into the classroom, because there's nothing we're doing that actually mirrors the nonsense or foolishness that they're saying that we're doing, right? Are we teaching lessons on slavery and racism? Yeah. Are we blaming, Kylie for it? No. Should she be developing a sense of blame and shame for it? No, they're not responsible. There's no kid in the classroom today that's responsible for slavery or for Jim Crow. That's ridiculous. But they are responsible for tomorrow, and they won't be prepared for tomorrow or even for today if they don't understand how we got here in the first place. So I think one of the things that we need to do is open up our classrooms, right? Because we're not hiding anything. This is what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing it. We know from Southern Poverty Law Center has done a number of surveys. The National Education Association has done surveys that tell us that parents very much like their teachers, the teachers that are teaching their individual children, right? They very much like them, but they get a little concerned about other teachers, right? In other words, it's almost like Congress, right? Everybody hates Congress, but they love their own individual representatives. That's why they keep sending them back. And it's the same thing. So teachers have to lean into that, right? Your parents, right? You got a couple crazy ones out there. I got a kid, I got kids too. I understand what it means to be a crazy parent. But for the most part, they're like, do what you do. We trust you. Do it. And you do it well. But invite them into the classroom. This is why I'm talking about this in the beginning, because just in case you do get that one parent, and it's usually now not even people who have parents and kids in the classrooms, right? I mean, it's outsiders who are just looking to antagonize and weaponize this history. If that happens, then you have parents who will come to your defense and say, that's not what's going on. I know this because I've been following along. I know I've been invited into these conversations, right? And so one of the things that we have to do, I think, is make clear what it is that we're teaching. And the only way that you can do that and cut through some of the myths and misconceptions that are out there about teaching, about those who teach this stuff, is to say, look, I have nothing to hide. This is it. You either can deal with the truth or not. And if you want to get rid of me, you're not going to get rid of me for lying. You're going to get rid of me because I'm teaching the truth.
Yeah. So many nuggets there. I mean, I think just proclamation that, there really is no decision here to make, that you have to, well, one, as teachers, we teach, and we don't teach, what feels comfortable. We don't teach what we like. I mean, sure, we do teach what we like, but ultimately we have a sort of professional responsibility and ethical obligation to, as you put it so nicely, teach hard history, but teach the truth. And then to be transparent and open about that. And so I'm imagining, even as you were talking about having parents come into the classroom, for those who can't, travel, can't get off their jobs, there are lots of that. It becomes a metaphor for how we teach, that maybe the teacher's newsletter to the parents includes insights from the lesson, that there are ways to use social media and video to let parents know what's going on in the classroom, what the lesson's about, so that when they do hear the things that are being circulated, all the fiction as if it's fact, they can say, no, that's not happening in my son or daughter's classroom.
And along those lines, sharing with parents and community, you could put community in quotes, sort of the broader community outside of your classroom, the questions and the statements and the insights that kids say, right? Like we were talking about this, and this is the question your child asked. And it's like, wow, okay, they're thinking about this. I mean, and that is, we're talking about preschoolers, all the way up to 12th graders, right? Like, these are the questions that they're asking. And now, if you want me to tell your kid, I'm not going to answer that, I'm not, that's on you. But I'm telling you what they're asking me, right? And the profound insights that they're offering in response to the questions that I'm asking them. And then what you wind up having is the parents begin to take the kids more seriously as thinkers themselves. So all of this nonsense about anti-CRT, divisive issues, and all this other stuff, all that is, you have political conservatives who are responding to the fact that young people, and not just young black folk, because they can care less about what black and brown people are thinking and saying, but you got young white kids, right? In the summer of 2020, tens of millions taken to the streets, and who were coming home asking questions. Like, we got to end systemic racism. I mean, that's shaking stuff up, right? They were like, wait a minute, right? So in other words, the work that we have been doing, right? And I'm using the royal we, all of us, right? Both in college and community educators and K through 12 teachers, it was making a difference. Kids were questioning, right? Not just, in the summer of 2020, with George Floyd protests, Breonna Taylor protests, but March for Our Lives, Black Lives Matter, Women's March. I mean, these young people were like, no, this isn't working. And part of what was helping them see that it wasn't working, that society wasn't working, was the lessons that they were learning, right, in the classroom. Critical analyses of the American experience, talking about the experience of women, talking about the experiences of African Americans, and extracting those lessons to say, that myth of perpetual progress is just that. It's a myth, right? We got to move beyond that. And so they will begin to ask these questions. And when you're being challenged with, you're an elected official and you're being challenged with, the question of what are you going to do about systemic racism? There's really only two answers. Either you're going to do something to change systems and structures, or you're going to do nothing. And those who are benefiting from existing systems and structures are like, yo, we ain't trying to do nothing. And if you do nothing, you got to be able to justify it. You got to be able to have a public justification. And as it turns out, the public justification was these children don't know what they're asking for because they're being indoctrinated. And that is when we get this whole anti-CRT, and then it's anti-woke, and now it's diversity, equity, inclusion. All of that is a smokescreen to continue to limit our children from learning. We were doing what was right, and it was sinking in. It was making a difference. We could have been doing more, of course, right? We could have had even a more powerful, more profound effect. But even just that little bit that we were doing shook these folk to the core, that now they're doubling down on their anti-democratic stances.
Yeah. I mean, you see so much of it in what we watch every single day coming out of Washington. All of the executive orders and the executive actions, anti-DEI, anti-gender, anti-woke, anti-CRT. I mean, and the list goes on and on.
It's anti-everything. It's like, what do you stand for anything? I mean, everything is just anti.
Yeah. With no clear guidance. I mean, one about, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So I'm going to go here because it's in my mind. I was reading some of your pieces this week, and one of your papers, you talk about the fact that, there's been this critique of Black social movements, usually from folks on the other side who say, well, they're protesting, but they're not being clear about what they want. There's no clear list of demands. There's no clarity to the advocacy. It's just making a ruckus just to be making a ruckus. And whether you do that by marching in the streets or by protesting online or creating a hashtag or whatever it might be, you actually push back in your paper and say, one, that's just a tactic of the other side. Mm-hmm. And that in fact, whether it was the SNCC back in the civil rights movement or any other group, many of these Black social movers and changers, social change agents, have been quite clear in what they're trying to do. And you, not only in your own piece, but you, through your citations, call out that, what Black folk were fighting for, some of the things we're still fighting for. They want the right to vote. They want the right to, own property. They want the right to, assume and acquire wealth, all sorts of things that, this nation, through its creed, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, promised to all citizens. So my question is this, listening to the media today, and especially with those who are responding to the anti-CRT, DEI movements, you're hearing the same sort of refrain, you know, that it's just being cantankerous for cantankerous sake, you know, pushing back without a clear agenda. What would you say? And what are your thoughts about this particular situation today?
Well, I think you laid it out. It's a familiar pattern. It's a familiar response to those in power. It's a way of undermining the legitimate demands, and we see it play out in a number of different ways, right? I mean, one is just, we don't even know what they're asking for. Well, it's actually quite clear whether we're talking about sort of local issues or people demanding national issues, right? You just take a minute and just listen, right? And you figure it out. But for those who aren't, sort of privy to the demands that are being made, and they're just catching, a short segment on TV, then it's like, well, if they don't know what they're asking for, then how can we respond? Like, half the time you just read the sign. Like, what is, you got people with protest signs, just read the sign. It says everything they want right there, right? They want police reform. Okay, that's called police reform, right? They want bail reform. It's called bail reform. Right? So it's not that complicated, but it's one of the ways of undermining the legitimacy of the protest, and also creating a shield for doing nothing. Right? Is why, he's like, well, what do you want me? I would like to respond, but I'm not sure what they demanded. Right? I mean, it was the same thing. You have folk who were, within that, so 2020 was really, we need to spend more time, reflecting on that, because all of this stuff we see playing out, right? Kids were taken to the streets talking about take down these Confederate statues. And, city leaders in Richmond and elsewhere, we don't know what they want. They just said, take down the statue. Like, what are you saying? It's like, it's not that complicated, right? But so we see that, but we also see, right, and I think as we move deeper into the Trump administration, these next 4 years, we're going to see increasing protests, right? As people as people are going to be taken to the streets in increasing numbers, and one of the tactics that are used in response that we saw during the Civil Rights era, we saw during Black Power era, saw in every protest, over the last 50 years, is the people will say, those aren't local people, those are outsiders, right? Those are outside agitators. We see it at every campus protest, right? It's like, well, don't worry, parents, those weren't students being harmed, those are all outside agitators. Well, that's a way of creating distance, right? Well, I don't need to respond to them because we don't even know who they are. I know who they are. They're our students because I see 3 of them from my class right there in the front. Right. So we have to be mindful of this idea of trying to separate out, right, who the protesters are, and then making them sort of anonymous. Well, we don't have to respond to them if they're anonymous. We don't have to take their demands seriously. So, it's the patterns of response, which is designed to delay, which is designed to limit the effectiveness of the action. None of that is familiar. They're all going to be familiar. We just have to be ready to respond to them when we see them.
Took the words right out of my mouth. I was thinking like these tactics are to delay really addressing the issues. And at some point, I believe many people lose hope and stop fighting, stop trying, stop thinking outside the box and doing things to kind of address their needs. So, to those folks, especially with the people that we have in administration today, be a fence all around us. There are some who may just like, I'm not going to try anymore. What do you say to them?
Yeah, it's hard. It's tough and it's challenging. I think it's important that we acknowledge and recognize first, or realize first, that things don't always get better in America, right? Like we sort of fed this sort of, version of America's past that, yeah, things may have been bad once, but they always get better, right? Racial progress, right? You go from, Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King to Barack Obama to Beyonce, right? Like stuff is always getting better. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of periods within there. Most of the time, things are either maintaining sort of the status quo or they're actually getting worse, right? So first we got to be clear and sort of, not look at, how change occurs through rose-colored glasses, so we won't always be surprised when there is a strong pushback against the things that we are in fact trying to achieve and trying to accomplish. So that's one. But there's also a number of other lessons. So that's understanding. Like, all right, I see this is coming. I received after the one of the hats that I wear. I sit on the board of the ACLU of Ohio. Do good work. Past board chair. Do really good work. And our executive director, a couple of days after the election, sent out a email to to supporters and to the board members and some staff. And he had a great insight. He said, "Listen," he said, give yourself permission to breathe, right? To grieve, just to take a moment. And as long as that moment needs to be, just to collect yourself, because this was a loss and things are going to get worse before they get better. As I like to say, brace for impact. But when you're ready, we'll be here and we'll be fighting, and you're welcome to come. And I think that's really important. We're all going to, especially those who are committed and see the value and importance of justice and equality and diversity and inclusion. This was a loss, and the hits are going to keep coming. And we do have to sort of take those moments and allow that to sink in. But then there will come a point when you're like, yeah, I'm ready to go now, right? And so when that, only when that is. For some of us, it's gonna be a little bit shorter. Look, those first couple of weeks, I was like, man, I don't want to talk to nobody, right? I'm MSNBC news blackout. I'm done, right? I know what's I just don't want to deal with this. So that's fine. The couple of weeks, I'm like, all right, like it's about to hit the fan. I know as soon as January 20 comes, I got to be on. So I say, okay. For others, it may be another week or two. It may be another month or two. It may be 6 months. It may be a year. That's fine, right? But when you're ready, we'll be here and we'll be ready to go. But it's important that you come in as your full self, right? So if you come in, you don't really want to be, that's not going to work anyway. Now, the other thing is, one of the critical lessons that's often overlooked from the Civil Rights Black Power era is that, it wasn't a lot of people who were actually involved. And certainly not a lot of people on the front lines. I remember asking a student in my class one time, I said, how many people were at the March on Washington? And there's 250,000 people at the March on Washington, right? And I was like, I know he's going to say more than 250,000 people, right? My man said everybody. And I was like, what? He said everybody. Everybody was at the March on Washington, right? I said, but that speaks to this idea that in the Civil Rights Movement, like everybody was there. Everybody was down. It was like 10 people. Right? Like if you had 10% of a local community, that night sky, if you had 10% actively engaged, right, you were really rolling. And so the critical lesson coming out of the Civil Rights era is it doesn't take a lot of people to make a big difference. And we got to understand that. Now, it's nice if you get 1 million people coming to a march, but that's not going to sustain this stuff, right? It's a handful of people digging in the trenches, whether they're lawyers or scholars or even you're at your own job, right? It doesn't take everybody marshaling. It just takes a handful of people. The other thing that's connected to that, and this is a lesson that Reverend James Lawson, who was really the prophet of nonviolence, coming out of Nashville, he's the one that taught Diane Nash and James Bevel and John Lewis, right? Brought them into the leading a life of philosophical nonviolence. One of the things that he understood, he said, listen, if you put yourself out there, if you serve as a servant to the people, and the people will see the sacrifices that you make and are making for them, they will rally to your side. Right. So the point was, don't wait for the people, lead the people through your own actions, and then the people will come. And he's been proven to be right time and time and time again.
Awesome. Jaquin, you want to ask a third question?
Oh, yeah. I can ask. Given your research on past Black social movements, what lessons do you see from the civil rights and Black power eras that are or aren't being applied in today's activism for racial justice?
Yeah. Well, with regard to electoral politics, I think, and we see this really plainly, is that we've gotten very good at, we've mastered the art of voter mobilization. Right? We can turn people out to the polls. The lesson that we learned that we've lost from the civil rights era, though, is voter education. And that, I think, really cost us in this last election, because we're fighting against something that even during the civil rights era was different. And that's the level of disinformation and purposeful misinformation exists at a level that no one else has ever had to deal with, right? Who have been fighting, fighting for justice, not in this way. And so one of the things that we saw is like, people were able to turn out to vote, but the amount of people, even now, right, who are, it's like, well, I voted for Donald Trump, but I didn't realize that this is what Project 2025 was about, right? And it's like, that's an education issue, right? Mm-hmm. And so, there's been a lot of, thinking about the lesson, right? There's been a lot of sort of, armchair, quarterbacking about, well, how did the Democratic Party lose and Kamala Harris lose? Is a messaging issue. They didn't reach out. They didn't have the right messages for sort of working class people. I was like, that's not true. Like, go back and look at the messages. All of the messages were right? From whether it's from Kamala Harris or her surrogates, but it didn't break through the disinformation, right? It didn't break through that. And so then it becomes an education thing. How do you get it? How do you make sure that ordinary people understand what the stakes are, and not just so that they vote in a particular way, right? Because, there's some local elections that'll be going on, but you're not going to have another congressional election for another 2 years almost, right? So this is, okay, how do people understand in this moment what's happening to them, right? That's an education problem. And I'm not talking about classroom education. I'm talking about the civics of the geography of the world in which we live. And we have to figure out how to get messaging out, whether we are talking about elected officials getting that out or just individuals, people who are committed to this, right? And that's, you guys are doing that in part through the podcast, right? And how do we create and use alternative media sources to get the word out, which is so critically important, because if people know, they will choose a different path.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really powerful observation that, we hear that all the time. And even in previous episodes where we've had guests talking about essentially what happened in this last election, a lot of it is, sort of reflecting this belief that the messaging wasn't right. It didn't resonate. It didn't speak to the realities of the base. And so to hear you say that, if you go back and listen to what Kamala Harris talked about, it's everything that people wanted. It's that, safe schools and jobs with fair wages and healthcare and safe communities. It's everything that people are, well, it's right. The things we're gonna have to fight for right now. Yeah. But that the problem is the prism of disinformation that has to be sort of broken through and hopefully ultimately dismantled and removed. That's a really.
And if I could add, part of the challenge, and this is the challenge as President Kennedy would have said in June of '64 when he was introducing the Civil Rights Act, as old as the scriptures themselves, and that is white supremacy in this nation. Because if it was just, when I say it's an education issue, right, we got to get people informed. Like, yeah, but you can't it's not just as simple as, oh, here's a fact sheet. Right. Let me just read it over. And people are like, oh, OK. No, because the prism of misinformation and disinformation is also coated with racism. Right. And so you can present the facts and folk will default to their racist understanding of how those facts have been derived. And the one thing, Donald Trump knows two things. He knows hate and he knows racism, and he knows the power of both. And in American society, racism is the most powerful political tool that we have ever created. And he has deployed it with great effectiveness and without any reluctance whatsoever. And so all of this, it's DEI pilots who are causing stuff to crash. That's just because he knows the power of racism to deflect, right, from reality. And so in presenting the information that we need, that people need to understand, we have to be prepared to name the ways in which racism is used to undermine the legitimacy of these critiques. And so you can't, now some of it you would think it was like, oh, this is obvious, right? You fire in tens of thousands of federal employees, and you're gonna say that's DEI? Like, what do you say, right? So, but again, for those who are not as directly affected, right? They're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? This is going to be black people and all these other, all these folk who don't have the qualifications for it anyway. They're relying on their racism, right, to keep folk supporting policies that are detrimental and harmful to so many in this country and around the world.
Yeah. And your, earlier comments, you talked about one of your students in a conversation you had in the class. So before I go to the next question, I'm just curious, in all of the roles you've played with the, ACLU, with the redesign of the museum, you come in contact with lots of students, not only those that you teach and in the department and the center. I mean, have you seen some shifts and changes over time? Are students coming into this academic study of history with a greater sense of consciousness and knowledge about these issues, or is it the opposite direction?
Yeah, it ebbs and flows. I've been teaching the same course on civil rights history, same time, same semester, same time, Tuesday and Thursday at 12:45 for almost 2 decades now at Ohio State. And, during the Obama years, the number of students who were enrolling in that class was declined over those 8 years. So that by the start of 2016, leading up to the election, there was only about 22 students in that class. Every year of Trump's term one, leading from 2016 up to 2020, the number of students who enrolled in that class increased. We went from 22 to 45 to 70 the next year. And then the pandemic hit and we went online, and I was like, oh, it's going to be interesting to see, how many people enrolled. 120 kids enrolled. Right. Whoa. And stayed with the class in the fall of 2020 and stayed with the class. Only 3 kids dropped out, and they were emailing me apologetically. Right now, you never get 117 out of 120 to stay in the class. Right. And to a person, those kids were trying to figure out how to change the world. Like they were all in. And I mean, it was phenomenal in those last couple of years, because it was like walking in the classroom. It was like being a coach and just rolling the ball on the court, like sitting back and like, all right, go win a championship, right? I mean, they were trying to figure this out. But then quickly, guys, it turned, right? Like within 2 years. And I don't know if I haven't quite figured it out. And I do think this was partly the pandemic, right? Because the kids I had in the classroom had a different set of experiences in 2020, leading up to 2020, versus kids 3 years later who were in high school in 10th grade, 9th grade, something like that. But within 3 years, I'm expecting the same thing. I'm rolling the ball on the court, like, all right, what do y'all want to do? And they just looking at the ball roll from one end of the floor to the other end. I'm like, pick the damn thing up. Like, what are y'all doing? And it was just, I mean, so it dipped, right? And there was a kind of complacency. There was a kind of fear, and also a kind of uncertainty mixed with a kind of entitlement, right? So there was a high level of entitlement, like, shouldn't you just give this to me, right? But also a high level of insecurity. And so I was like, man, I don't know what to do with this. Like, just give me the kids who want to change the world. But it's also, I've seen already, right, just within this last year, that changing again. So the pendulum is shifting again, almost just as quickly. And the kids that I have in my class, civil rights class, same time, same room, same thing. We got 75, and they're like, yeah, we're trying to figure this out, Dr. J. I'm like, all right, let's try and figure it out. So I think conditions and circumstances absolutely play a role, but we also have to realize that, I don't know what's going to happen going forward, right? Because we part of the decline, I think, that I saw in my classes, but we also saw a decline in humanities, right? People taking humanities classes because they're telling these kids K through 12, you got to go into business, you got to go into sciences, right? Never mind humanities. And now it's all about work, and it's definitely not about courses that have a diversity component or talking about equity or social justice and this, that, and the other. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. In Ohio, the state legislature is passing, they have a bill that came out of the Senate, is working its way through the House, and they have been trying to get this passed for the last couple of years. And it's basically, designed to tell us what we can and cannot teach, not K through 12, but at the college level, right? And sometimes I forget, I be talking crazy and I forget I'm a state employee. I'm like, damn, like, oh, I forgot about that, right? And but so I don't even know. Ohio State, how these colleges do, every couple of years they rewrite the general education requirements. And Ohio State rewrote its general education requirements, but it was a different day. So even though in the last few years, even though we just implemented it, right, it's like you got to have diversity component and all this other stuff, which they want to go after. And the question will become: we got a new president who's there now. It's like, what are you going to do? What are you going to stand for? And I have no faith. He's demonstrated nothing in the year or so that he's been here to say that he's going to stand up and push back, right? I mean, he punts on these issues more than an Ohio State football player. It's like, what are you doing? So he's going to have to be pushed. He's going to have to be pushed by the students. He's going to have to be pushed by the faculty. He's going to have to be pushed by parents. But the question about what am I seeing? Like now, I'm like, okay, I'm seeing these kids are fired up, but how are they going to be in 2 years after they've been having this crush, this weight on their shoulders, telling them what they can and cannot do? Either one or two things going to happen. They're not going to stay the same. They're either going to become more engaged and more active, or they're going to retrench. Time will tell.
Time will tell. Very well said. Well, we're coming up at the top of the hour, so we got 2 questions. So we figured for these last 2, we would pivot and go in a different direction. So I'm going to tag in Jaquin to ask the 4th question. But y'all know, everyone who's watching, people, I know in my circle, in my network, we're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you got Professor Jeffries. Is he going to bring his brother? And I guess got to say this. I mean, I love to watch the 2 of you sort of communicate to each other on social media. You'll tag each other or make a comment, some sort of inside joke. But we thought we might talk with you a little bit about both your work as a historian and certainly your brother's work as a congressman. Jaquin?
Yeah. So as you said, your brother's a Congressman Hasan Jeffries, is at the center of national politics. How do you see history shaping today's policy debates, particularly on racial justice, voting rights, DEI, and education?
Yeah. Well, one of the sort of ongoing, and by ongoing, I'm talking about ongoing debates between my brother and I, and this is, goes back to, when we were sleeping in bunk beds in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, New York in high school. Was the significance and importance of the role of the law versus sort of everyday people, sort of lawyers versus sort of the Ella Bakers. I mean, we've been debating that, so I went and got, PhD in history, and his background is in law, right? He's a law degree from NYU. So he's always been trumpeting sort of, it's law, you got to use the law and this, that, and the other. I'm like, man, it's about the people. People push lawyers, right? You ain't got no case if you ain't got the people. And so, but he does have a good understanding of sort of the, of history. And I think in this moment right now, like, we have to understand history to understand the implications of the decisions that are being made, and also why some of the decisions are being made and framed the way they are. Some people are like, man, why are they rolling back, this attack on diversity and equity, right? Like, why I was like, because they're still mad about the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Like this is literally an attempt to undermine the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? Because they're mad that the federal government said don't discriminate. Like, well, we want to be discriminated. We want to be able to discriminate. I mean, so history informs sort of what policies are happening now, but it also is very much tied up in the law. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker Emerita now, I remember after the Dobbs decision was handed down, which overturned Roe v. Wade. She was holding a press conference outside of on the steps of the nation's Capitol. And she was talking about how problematic, how difficult, how challenging, how terrible this decision was. And I fully agree. And then she said, never before in American history have rights been granted and been taken away. And I was like, Nancy, hold up, right? I was like, that's the entirety of the African-American experience, right? I mean, so it's important that we understand that history because it helps us understand not only the moment, but it also helps us prepare a response, right? So you can be shocked. You can be shocked that they overturned Roe v. Wade, right? But you shouldn't be surprised, right? Because the Supreme Court, for example, has been, with the exception of a 20-year period, the Warren Court has been actively hostile against expanding basic civil rights and human rights for people. So you have to understand. So right now, history tells us, like, yeah, there may be some lower courts and possibly some federal courts that are going to block this stuff, but the Supreme Court ain't on our side. It's not on the side of the people. It hasn't been for the last 50 years, right? There's a 20-year period, and then now we all caught up with the Supreme Court. So you can't look to the courts for the kind of help that we're going to need. We can't even look to our elected officials, right? People banging on Democrats like, you got to do more. You got to do more in Congress. No, ain't about. They're out of control. They don't have any power, right? We voted them out of the three branches, right? So, they can raise a hue and cry and leverage some stuff, but ain't much they can do. Now it's about the people, right? It's about the pressure that people are going to bring to bear, right? At our colleges and universities, telling presidents, don't roll this stuff back. At our corporate companies and corporations, telling businesses, do not roll this back. At our county governments and city governments, telling we are not going back. And again, what's the messaging, right? Brother Terrell, you said, what was Kamala Harris talking about? We're not going back. Right? That's what we say now. We ain't going back. Like, what? Again, the messaging was there. We just chose to ignore it, right? But that's where we are. And it's going to be the people. The people are going to have to demand and be serious about this. And hopefully, and we're seeing it now, right? We're starting to see some of those town hall meetings, right? Where people are like, hold up, man. Like, I didn't sign up. I didn't sign up for this to lose my job, right? I didn't have a black job, right? White people, I didn't have a black job. Why my job got to go, right? Well, when you vote to harm others, you wind up harming yourself. And so I think that's where we are. So history is central to this, right? It helps us understand the moment, but it also helps us understand the language. And to go back to the earlier point that we were making and discussing, that question of how do we understand and make sense of the moment, right? You got to have that history to understand how these people are responding, so we can help educate people, right? Like, okay, this is what's happening. This is why this is happening, and this is why they're framing it like that. And we're seeing, I mean, it's so much, right? I mean, this is why I was the first question. What's the letter, the jarring, right? I mean, not only dealing with the domestic stuff and the federal government, but now you got Trump, with Ukraine, and you can just see, right? Like literally the propaganda, the Russian propaganda, right? He's like, oh no. And how quick it flips. And then how quickly these other folk fall in line behind him just because he's behind dear leader. I mean, this is a lesson for us in how authoritarians come into power in real time, and how people roll over so quickly and bend the knee and give up on the very principles of democracy that we're supposed to hold dear.
Wow. I mean, I have one quick follow-up. I want to go to the last question, but you just mentioned, that at this point in time, there's pretty clear evidence that, we must follow all the things we've been talking about, be clear about what we want and pursue it. And that, I've heard a lot of people say, well, all of these executive orders are going to just keep coming, but we need the courts to intervene. And you just said it, we can't wait and depend on the courts. We can't wait and even depend on the elected officials, especially since depending on which side of the aisle you're on, they're in the minority, numerical minority, and many were elected out. So in one of your papers, you talk about, I think this is an analysis you did of the whole Black Power movement, right? And you talked about the independent political party. I mean, do you see any space for that in today's time? And what's your perspective on the two major parties plus some other political positions that people might be able to take to sort of achieve the goals we want for the country?
Yeah. So, the question, first thing we have to be realistic about and be clear about our political structure. And we live in a two-party system, right? I mean, Congress is set up for two parties. And so when we're thinking about third-party alternatives at the national level, it's just politically unrealistic. And so we got to be clear about that. And we've seen the consequences of that. We saw it in 2016 at the federal level when folk were voting for a third-party candidate and Trump gets in over Hillary Clinton. And we saw it again. People saying, well, I'm not going to vote for Kamala Harris, even though, I don't like Donald Trump. There's a third party. I'm going to cast my vote there. Well, let's just be realistic, right? That's a wasted vote, right? Especially if you were in a battleground state, and we know in this day and age, these elections are so close. So while I understand the sentiment about, well, this party doesn't represent everything that I believe in. Well, it's two parties. It's not going to represent everything anybody believes in completely, right? Because it's only, you get two people to agree on anything, right? So this is what it is. But the sentiment is important. The sentiment of independent politics is important. So in other words, we should be, and this is one of the lessons that comes out. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, he was like, look, he was talking about at the local level, right? So he's talking about local parties, county level, if you could, statewide perhaps. And he said, in those places where African Americans, and this is coming out of the era of segregation and Jim Crow, he said, in those places where African Americans are a numerical majority and the law allows, they should form their own political parties. No reason to go into the Democratic Party, no reason to go into the Republican Party for other, for reasons at the time. Democratic Party in the South was the party of white supremacy. I mean, literally, they were like, we are the party of white supremacy. So like, why are you going to go in there, form your own party? But then he said, in those places where African Americans, where Black people are a numerical minority, which is in most places, he said they should come together and enter into coalition from positions of strength. Right, like that's critical. It's like you got to organize. So whether you're trying to form a independent party or not, you have to organize, right? And you have to, especially so Black folk in this instance, right, have to come together. Whatever the group interest is, you got to come together and enter into coalition, but from a position of strength, so that your priorities don't get lost when others come in as well. And I think that is what the critical lesson from the history of independent politics is like, how do you preserve your interests when you enter into coalition? Because we have to be in coalition. There's no doubt about that. The higher we go up in government, you have to enter into coalition. But the history has been that when Black folk enter into coalition, then suddenly our interests drop off. And we have to make sure that our interests remain a priority, because if once you prioritize the interests of Black folk, then what winds up happening is everybody's basic civil rights and human rights get protected and expanded. Like that has also been very much a lesson of the African American experience. I only wish more people understood that, right? Once you support Black folk, right, that things always get better for everyone. But then when you also go after Black folk, that's the sign, that's the canary in the mine that things are about to get a lot worse for everybody else.
Dr. Jeffries, I cannot let you just say that and keep it pushing. Say it again for the people so they can tweet it.
Well, look, I don't even know what I said. But I mean, we lean, the thing is, right, and this is what we haven't, as a whole, we haven't taken Black folk and Black issues seriously enough. And when we take Black folk seriously, when we prioritize their interests, their critique of American society, everybody benefits. Everybody benefits. We would all be benefiting now if we just supported the system. Like that is not even that complicated. Like had we done that, we would all be in a better place now. That shouldn't even be debatable ever. But also, and we're seeing this with the conversation that we had today, we're talking about DEI and anti-CRT and all this other stuff. When they come after us, everybody suffers because they're coming after you next. We have always been like the last hired, the first fired. We are the first attacked, and we're also the first who are thrown under the bus when problems happen. So we have to be aware of that.
I mean, you're right on the spot. You said conversation, so we'll even modify it just to wrap up a little bit. What is it like? You are an award-winning and incredible historian who worked on the redesign of the museum. Your brother, congressman, and the minority leader, Democratic Party. I'm sure your parents are incredibly proud of both of you. We certainly are. But let's let our our audience sort of peek behind the curtain. what is it like? Thanksgiving dinner, I don't know, Christmas dinner around the table. Do you and Hakeem talk about these things? Are these off topic or off subject? You can't talk about them. What was it like in your family?
Yeah, no. I mean, as with most Black families, there's no especially when it comes to politics, right? There's no subjects that we ignore, right? Like everything. I was surprised when I met white folk and they were like, "Nah, we don't talk about politics." I'm like, "Really?" Like we were 3 years old, right? And we're hearing it. They wouldn't, our parents wouldn't. They were like, "You got to sit there and be quiet," right? But it was always those conversations around the dinner table and when family came together. So no. We always talk. About what's going on. I mean, that's just part of the culture in which we came up in. But we talk about sports and movies more so than anything else, right? Something like, "Oh, did you see this?" Right? Like, did you watch this episode of Game of Thrones? I mean, so and then we have our good natured stuff. One of the things that and this still boggles the mind of my oldest daughter, who's 14, who's a big sports fan. She's like, she realized, not too long ago, she was like, "How come like you and your brother like don't root for the same teams?" I was like, "We don't. I'm a Mets fan, he's a Yankees fan. He's a Jets fan, I'm a Giants fan." I was like, "We just had different teams." And so we always talking smack about that. You know what I'm saying? So, it's a good natured rivalry, good sibling rivalry, a lot of fun. But I love him dearly. And if pressed, he might admit that he loves me too. So
He does. I can read between the lines. Sometimes I look at those tweets. I'm like, what are they really saying to each other? And what I know is that these are two brothers who are proud of each other, who are doing their own thing, holding it down. Well, Dr. Professor Jeffries, thank you for being on the podcast tonight. Thank you for your work, your teaching, changing the world one student at a time, one course at a time. But your research, your scholarship is making a difference. And so, sort of wrapping up where you gave us, people are not responsible for the past, but they are responsible for the present and the future. And so for everyone who's listening in our listening audience, who've watched this episode, we encourage you, share it with other people. Find a way, if you don't know history, to, go to YouTube, find Professor Jeffries' TEDx talk. Go to your local community college, take a course. You have to go to community college, Coursera, a whole bunch of providers are out there. Educate your mind so that you can sift through the fiction, the things that masquerade around as if they're fact, because it's getting in the way, all that disinformation. And we invite you to always tune in to this podcast, Do Good Work Podcast. Excited to have all of you here listening across all the platforms. I'm going to give it over to Jaquin. What do you want them to take from tonight's episode, Jaquin, or what are you walking away
Listen,
with?
I have to listen again myself because there are so many nuggets that I'm going to write down and tweet over the week on Do Good Works social media. But the one thing, two things I think three things captured tonight's conversation is one, that it doesn't take everyone to create change, just a handful, y'all. It just take a handful. We don't need every Black brother or sister to march with us. We just need a handful that are committed to the work. But although, you're committed, there are days where it can be tiring and you can pause, breathe, and take a break. And like Dr. Jeffries said, it may be a couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months, a year or two. But when you come back, we'll be ready. We're right here waiting for you. And then lastly, I'm tweeting this tonight. When you vote to harm others, you wind up harming yourself. That's true. So many of you all just hate Black folk and voted against them and end up messing yourself up.
Now you feeling it.
So I think that it's important for us to educate ourselves and not just take what we read on in social media or take what the president says to us and count it as law, but do our work, do due diligence and research ourselves and use our own mind that God gave us to make our own decisions. That's what I have. That's what I have tonight.
Sitting on the plane today beside a lovely, I forget her name, Ethel, older woman, white woman, who ended up having a conversation with me. And the heart of what we ended up talking about was sort of what you're sharing with us, Dr. Jeffries. And that is, it was clear to me that Ethel probably has not spent a lot of time consciously voting for Black folk and for Black issues. But what we were able to iron out while we waited there on the tarmac is that many of the issues that we're fighting for and that Kamala Harris stood for benefit humanity.
Yeah.
You know, Ethel, I don't know, she's probably in her early 80s, but she's talking about how long she spends waiting at the pharmacy for her medicines and how the cost of medicine is going high. And I'm thinking that's a Black issue. It may not be a Black job, or maybe it is a Black job. I don't know. But listen, you know, affordable healthcare, affordable drugs, people having access to food and jobs, and that they can go home and get back home safely. And that they can send their student off to school and they can be educated in a high quality school with teachers who are certified to teach in the subject. Those are the issues we're talking about, but they transcend race. They transcend identity. And so to anyone who's needed to hear that affirmed, then you hear it here on the podcast. You know, we're going to share out quite a few of Dr. Jeffries' publications. One that I want to call your attention to just because of the title, but the content is also good, is he has a paper called What's Old is New Again. And I hear that in the heart of what you're talking about tonight, Dr. Jeffries, that a lot of what we're watching come out of Washington looks new if you don't know the history, but what's old is coming back. It's new again. The good thing about that is there are lessons that we can learn from the past that will get us through the present and the future. So without further ado, we thank all y'all for tuning in. Get ready for next week's episode. We're excited. Same time, same channels. Until then, don't be afraid to do something. But if you're going to do something, as we say, do something good. Do good work. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to Do Good Work Podcast. We hope you found today's conversation informative, uplifting, and insightful. Don't forget to like and share
What just happened?
this episode with your networks. Follow us on social media at Do Good Work on X, formerly Twitter, for real-time updates, behind-the-scenes content, and so much more. Until next time, friends, don't be afraid to do something, but do something good. Do good work.
Thanks, man.
See you.
Okay, brother.